Hello, friends.
Welcome to the Liberation Chronicles. I'm Robin Parker.
And I'm Jorge Ceballos. This is the first episode of the Liberation Chronicles, a series in which we hope to give voice to liberation in our current historical context and discuss what it means to build a truly inclusive society.
In addition to that mission, we want to be highly conversational. We think that issues around cultural diversity are often complex, and if we're going to keep it together as a society, we've got to be able to talk about what is complex so we can make better decisions.
In this first episode, we're going to lay the groundwork for future episodes. We're going to talk about who we are and how we influence our perspective. We'll also discuss some of our core beliefs in the current historical and political setting that inspired us to make this series.
So, Jorge, I mentioned having a conversational tone. Why do you think having a conversational tone around cultural diversity, inclusion, DEI, whatever we want to call the work, however the work is phrased, why do you think that a conversational tone is especially important?
I think there are two things for me, Robin. One is I feel a conversational tone makes the content more accessible to all types of audiences. In our work, as you know, and pretty much probably in every profession, there's jargon that develops. There's a way in which insiders talk about a specific topic that for someone that is not on the inside may feel like the language is inaccessible, is not really easy to understand. So I feel a conversational tone maybe will begin to break down those barriers of accessibility to the language and just maybe invite more people into the conversation. So that's one thing. The other thing for me, Robin, is as you know, we've been to many conferences over the years. And there's something that happens in those conferences that I've always really appreciated, which is there are conversations that happen outside of a lecture hall or a workshop space. So conversations that may happen in the hallway as you walk out and you're talking to someone that just attended the same workshop with you. And then you're just having a very informal conversation about what you just heard, the content that you engaged in. And the conversation in that setting tends to be also very free-flowing, very informal, if you will, right? It also happens in the lobby as you meet with people and just sit down and just have a conversation, or you go out to dinner with some friends, or even when you're having drinks at the bar. I'm trying in my mind to replicate that feeling of being in that space where it's just a very casual conversation, very free flowing. Again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't go deep, but it also means that sometimes we'll just be laughing with each other. So that's the kind of space that I'm hoping the building that conversational tone will recreate.
Well, that's good. That means there's also room for humor, I suppose, right?
Absolutely.
Appropriate humor. And I'd also like to add that, of course, this is a YouTube channel, and we want to get comments from our viewers. One of the things that I think is important, though, is civility. And by that I mean we want to never invite people to be unkind, nasty, engage in name calling. So much of that is part of the political and the political discourse, and also what happens on social media. And I don't want to do that. I know you don't either, because I think what it does is it pushes the conversation away, and it gets into who can be snarkier and who can embarrass the other person the most. And I think we need to do better than that as a society. And I'd certainly like to model something that shows that, well, even though we have differences, and there are differences among us, that we know how to handle that as adults and in ways that are fruitful. So I'm certainly with you on that. Anything else you think might be important about our tone?
No, I think again, just make it as inviting as possible, making it feel like we're just in someone's living room, just having a chit chat about what we do and why we do it.
Okay, that sounds good. So, if I'm not mistaken, one of the next things we wanted to talk about was our backgrounds. Why in the world would we want to talk about our backgrounds? One might ask.
Yeah, so I think that even though in this work uh, there are ways in which we agree quite a bit on how we see things, how we understand the world we're in, how we understand what the work is about. At the same time, I also think there are differences, and those differences, can also help us broaden our understanding of what it means to be in the work, what it means to do the work, and how we do it and why we do it the way we do it. So I think there's a lot of value in understanding both our sameness and our differences. For me, they are part of the same coin. We come with both of those things at the same time. So understanding, for example, in our case, why I think about the work in a particular way, why there are certain things that maybe seem to matter more to me than to you. Uh, Again, not to mean that any of that is a reflection of our commitment to the work or how serious we are the work. It just happens to be that our different lived realities may lead to different ways of emphasizing parts of the work or showing up in a particular way. Right? So I feel that those are things that are important for us to lift up and work through.
I agree. It was interesting, as you said, although those differences don't have to be things that um, cause difficulties. I realized as you were saying that most people think that they will, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, oops, we're different on this, we're different on that. And so that means that we should probably not talk about it or talk about it very gingerly. We tend not to do that. I also think it is important occasionally to talk about our backgrounds because it can give people a good example of how to enter into difficult conversations. Often people simply say, well, this is my opinion, and you have to take it or leave it. And I do think it's important to share our opinions, but we can go a lot farther if people know, as you pointed out, why it is we have a particular opinion. What in our backgrounds drove that opinion? There's many things: how we grew up, the people that we listen to, the news programs we listen to, all kinds of experiences. And the reason that that's important is in sharing that, we can drive empathy for one another through our differences, listening better through our differences, than if I just say, well, this is my opinion. It's a really good opinion, and any other opinion just isn't really worthwhile. If I can say, I had these series of experiences that drove my opinion. You still might not agree with it,
Mm-hmm.
but at least you can empathize with what's going on with me, and we can begin to build a relationship. So I certainly agree with that. And switching the scenes here through the magic of magic, I wonder if you would be willing to talk a little bit about your background in relation to the work. And again, the work is cultural diversity, inclusion, belonging, all of the things that we've been doing for years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say for me, Robin, there are two things, two parts of my experience that have deeply impacted how I think about the work, how I think about my role in the work. What are the things that I feel more urgency around? So the two things are one, the experience of being an immigrant in this country. Now, here's an interesting thing, right? Because I know there are some folks out there that know my background and know that I was born in the States, born in Washington, D.C., of all places. Um, but I grew up in Lima, Peru. At the age of two, my parents, who were Peruvian, decided to move back to Peru. And so I grew up there. I finished high school there. So my formative years were spent in Peru. And everything that I learned there, culturally, values, all these things that begin to shape how you think about yourself, how you think about the world around you, what are things that are important, were really built there. My foundation of all that was built there. Now, eventually, I migrated to the United States a couple of times, and then the second time, at the age of 20, I ended up staying in this country. So I've been in this country for over 40. But those two times that I came into the United States from Peru, I had this experience of being an immigrant, showing up with a thick accent, showing up with, limited English, showing up with a different cultural makeup, if you will, and then having to learn to adjust to being here in a very different cultural environment. So, as I began to now understand the work, uh, it, my understanding comes through having lived through those experiences of being an immigrant. Also, by the way, then eventually my parents come into this country, and my sisters, I have two sisters, both of them come in. And both of them initially, all of them actually come in initially as tourists with a tourist visa, and then overstay in their tourist visa. So, what we call today undocumented immigrants. So, there's that experience too, and everything that it entails trying to gain legal status once you're in this country already undocumented. So there's that experience, even though it wasn't mine personally, it was from these people in my family very close to me that I watched them going through that process. So the immigrant experience is something that is very critical and important to how I see myself and how I see what it means to be in this world.
How would you characterize? I'm sure there's a lot in what it means to have an immigrant experience, but are there some major? You mentioned language, you mentioned accents. Are there some other major themes that you think go along with being an immigrant?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think again, for example, if we look at um, the landscape, if you will, of experiences that different groups may have in terms of their positionality, their presence, their the space they occupy in the United States. My experience of being a voluntary immigrant. I came to this country not because I needed to. I came because I wanted to. It made it easier, obviously, that I was a U.S. citizen, so I didn't have to worry about, coming into the country at any time I wanted. And those two times that I decided to migrate, first time was after I graduated from high school, and I came thinking, okay, well, I'm going to go to the United States, and then I'm going to apply to university and study there. Uh, didn't happen. I was here for a year in Austin, Texas, moved back to Peru for 2 years. And then came back again. The second time I came back, Robin, my plan was not to stay in this country, by the way. My plan was I'm just going to work and save money so I can travel the world. That was my plan. I'm still working on that, by the way. But I ended up staying. So again, it was a voluntary decision to come to this country at those 2 points for different reasons. I had different plans. But it is very different than, why I ended up being in this country as opposed to, for example, Native Americans that were here and they were invaded, if you will, by people from Europe. Their lands were taken over. Their whole life was turned upside down because of that presence, right? So that experience is very different than mine. It's also very different than the experience of enslaved Africans that were forced to come to this country. Again, just having that starting point, if you will, I believe, leads to a very different way of relating to the realities of exclusion, marginalization, and oppression that we often talk about in our work. So I think those things become very different. And again, not necessarily in a bad way, right? It's not like because I have this experience of being a voluntary immigrant sets me up to be in opposition or to be in conflict with folks that have had a very different experience in this country. But it's important to understand how it's different and how it informs how we see ourselves and how we move through the world.
I understand. Anything else you wanted to add about background? I mean, obviously, there's a lot in background, and our podcast can't be 8 hours long. But are there any other major themes that you'd like to talk about and share now?
Yeah. The last thing would be, Robin, that growing up in Peru, and let's for a minute, knowing that our conversation about liberation it's much broader than just one subject. But for the moment, right, just to engage in this conversation about one of the ways in which my experience growing up in Peru led to a very different entry point, if you will, into the conversation about race. So growing up in Peru, race was not an overt conversation that I remember having. As a matter of fact, it's a well-known fact that in most of Latin America, if not all of it, race was never an overt conversation. Just didn't happen, which led to many folks saying that race and racism in Latin America didn't matter, did not shape anything about our experience. Not true. And then maybe down the road in other episodes, we'll have a chance to explore some of that in more detail. But it wasn't a conversation that I remember having overtly. So coming into this country, I don't have a racial consciousness. I don't think about race. And then I come into this country where the conversation about race is very prevalent. Eventually, after several years and trying different kinds of occupations, I land in your office of bias, crime, and community relations, Robin. And I was hired by you and our good friend Pamela to work there as a facilitator in what we called at that time diversity trainings. So it is in that moment of being hired into that office to become a diversity trainer that for the first time now I am forced to seriously think about how race and racism have shaped my experience and my identity. At that point, I'm in my mid-30s. So again, I'm pointing that out because I believe that entering into a discussion, an exploration, a reckoning, if you will, with how race and racism shaped me, my sense of self, at the age of 35 is very different than entering into the conversation at the age of 5, which I know, from your experience is something that, you experienced very early in your life. So again, it's just different, not better, no, not worse, but just different. And it positions me then in a very different way than it would position you having that experience at such an early age. Right? So I think those things become really important.
Well, if I can ask you
Yeah.
then, because you said the conversation about race doesn't really happen in much of Latin America, most of Latin America, certainly not in the same way it does in the United States. So most people would say, oh, well, so race isn't a thing. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you see it as, well, I just came here and I was confronted with a society that was obsessed by race and I wasn't? Or was there another way that you had to tackle the concept of race in the United States?
Well, that was my initial response, right? Not having any sense of understanding about racism as a system, narratives that we've been exposed to that give us a sense of the world that we're in and sense of self. None of that. So I didn't have a good, solid racial analysis. So at first, when I get confronted with these things, like you said, I'm thinking, well, you're all just crazy. You're just obsessed with this thing, race. You make everything about race. What does that sound, Robin? Sounds like some folks that we have run into over the years, right? You make everything about race. But obviously, once I get hired to become a facilitator, and you and Pamela said, well, before you become a facilitator, we need you to go through our 3 levels of training that we offer twice, so you can begin to do your own work. Right? There's that notion that we all know in this work that to be in this work means that you have to do your own work. Right? So you were saying to me, hey, we want you to be a facilitator. In order for you to be a facilitator of somebody else's awakening, if you will, into race and racism, you have to do your own work. So yes, then I start from a place of, I think these conversations about race are overblown. And all of a sudden now I go in and I start doing my own work. And I began, Robin, to understand experiences that I had back home in Peru that I had never really thought much about, but they were there, right? They were there and somewhere in the back of my brain. Going through workshops with you and Pamela, I, for the first time now, began to look back at some of those experiences, began to make sense of them through a racial lens. And I'll tell you a quick story that I know you know because I've shared with you, but for our listeners. I'm in a workshop, and we've had some experiential activity that you facilitated. And I'm going back to my seat because we were up and moving around the room. And I'm going back to my seat. And in that experience of going back to my seat, this memory pops up in my head. I'm maybe 12, 13 years old, something like that. I'm back home in Peru at my house. And I remember my mother holding somebody's baby. Don't know whose baby it was, but somebody's baby. And she's pinching the baby's nose and pulling it up repeatedly. So I asked my mom, I said, Mom, why are you doing that? She says, so they grow up with a good nose. Now, notice nothing overtly racial was said. She didn't say, so they grow up with a nose that is not Black or indigenous. She didn't say that. But she said, a good nose. Now, at that moment, right, 12, 13 years, oh, okay, boom, I ran off and played with my friends. At the age of 35, this thing shows up again. It's like, oh, wait a minute. What do you mean a good nose, Mom? And at that point, I understood what that meant. A good nose, yeah, meant not a broad nose, either indigenous or black. That's not good, right? A good nose is the nose that my grandfather from Spain had, chiseled European looking nose. So again, a moment that lasted, I don't know, 20 seconds. So much was embedded in there about race.
Hmm.
And I'll take it a step further, right? Because this is how it played out. And now I'm like examining more. And I'm thinking, well, my father, who had a wide nose, is in that same room with us, and he's not objecting to the idea of a good nose. I mean, think about that, right? He didn't say anything, oh, wait, let's not talk about it that way. He's like, oh, yeah, let's do that. That gets even deeper, Robin, because then sharing sort of this memory with my sisters, my younger sister said, oh, wait a minute. You don't remember what happened to me when we were growing up. And what happened to her was my parents would go off to work, and like any good middle class, respectful middle class family in Peru, we had maids, live-in maids. So my parents would go off to work, and we were home with the maids. And my mother would tell the maids to put on a clothespin on my sister's nose because it seemed to be growing too wide. I mean, right? I mean, this is deep. This is some deep stuff. Like on the way to work, hey, Maria, please put a clothespin on and off throughout the day on Gina's nose so it doesn't grow too wide. I mean, that's so again, I'm in it, learning all these things, but at a very unconscious level. So yeah, those experiences, begin to make sense. My entry point, as you said, was like, what is this thing? Why are you so obsessed with race? And then all of a sudden, my world cracks open, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have been infused, embedded in this conversation about race my whole life and didn't know it.
Yeah, it's amazing how the messages that we get from society shape how we think or don't think about things. Right? Yeah, really important. Really
So what
important.
about you, Robin? What about your experience?
What about my experience? Well, once again, using a little magic here. I was born in the late 1950s. Promise not to go through all of my birth and childhood story, but it's important to frame it in terms of time. And so I was a young person during the 1960s, a pivotal time for civil rights in the United States. I suppose one of the most important things I can share, Jorge, about that background is that both of my parents were poor. Uh, my father grew up in southern Illinois, in a place called Mounds, Illinois, close to what is called Cairo. It's spelled like Cairo in Egypt, but it's Cairo. Mm-hmm. And they lived in a 2-room house. It had a kitchen and 1 bedroom, and there were 5 children. My father was able to ultimately become successful because he was a smart man, got a scholarship, and he was the first one in his family to be able to go to college and then into the military. My mother grew up in Bloomington, Illinois, which is central Illinois, also poor, a large family, and grew up with values that said education's really important. Both of them came from families where there was a legacy of being enslaved, and they grew up at a time where separate but equal was the norm, and they were both fighting to be seen as equal, as many African Americans were. It's like they wanted the same opportunities for a job. They wanted the same opportunities to shop in places that white people shopped. All of those things were part of the struggle. And so the messages that I got, especially from my father, was, you're a black kid, and this is what that means for you. And what he said it means for me is that you come from people that are working hard and are striving, but there are people who aren't going to like you, people who have prejudice. Be respectful, but be prepared for it. And that was certainly part of my experience. I would have teachers who didn't like me or who would reprimand me because they didn't like the notion of having a black kid in their class. And generally because my father was in the military. He was actually there as an officer, which was a big deal. There weren't that many officers of color in the Air Force, but it was a big deal. And so we moved to places where the population was mostly white. And so in school, I would almost invariably be the only black kid in school, and certainly the only black kid in the class. And so it was a time when people would go, oh, there's someone black here. That was new, right? Brown versus Board of Education was relatively new. And the idea of having black folks in school and shopping, let alone being friends with, potentially dating or marrying your kids, if you were white, was a really new and for many a troubling experience. So my experience was largely shaped by especially race and the feeling of never being completely included, always being the black kid in the situation, right? The other. That's not to say that everyone was cruel. They weren't, right? I had many good experiences. I had friends, but I also had this constantly reinforced awareness that things could go sideways, and often they would go sideways. When I might meet someone new, they might spout off, for example, something their parents had told them. Well, my mom and dad say that white people are running this world. I'm like, oh, okay, that's really great. That tells me a lot. Or stereotypes, about black people. Oh, you must really be into athletics. I'm relatively tall. Oh, you must play basketball, or the opposite kind of astonishment. Oh, your name is Robin. I didn't expect you. I mean, not only around gender, but also around blackness. There was this assumption that the name Robin Parker wouldn't be associated with someone who was black and who was male. And so there was all of these sort of bumpiness along the way, if you will, that informed who I am, and the need that I felt, even to this day, not simply to concentrate on the similarities. One of the things that I note that is different in my experience and expectations than other people who are in the majority is that I know that they mean well, but they will often say, well, we need to really concentrate on all the ways that we are the same. We have so much in common. We're human beings. And I don't disagree with that. I realize that as a species, we have very much in common. We don't have very much genetic variation. I realize that race is a social construct. I get all of that. And I also understand that we all have basic human needs. But because of my background, where the message was, black kid, get back, black kid, you're different, my position is, well, if we're only talking about the way we're the same, especially around race, you're kind of, well, not kind of, you're obliterating my experience, right? It's like, well, my experience wasn't always the same. And even if it was neutral, because I had experiences that weren't neutral, I had to walk in spaces being very careful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's my enemy? Who's my ally? How do I need to act to navigate this experience? Because I'm not white and everybody else is. What are the behaviors that'll get me into trouble? What are the behaviors that will make me safe? All of those things were part of my background. And I needed to, of course, have a kind of double consciousness. Um, a consciousness that says, yep, I'm a human being. I want to be part of the US society. It's the only society I know. There are things about it that I really appreciate and that I love, but I also have this consciousness of being the other, a Black man, in all that entails. And so I walk through the world with that. At all times. Does that mean that every thought I have is about race? No, certainly not. Like everybody else, I like my favorite food and like to hang out with friends. I like to do things that are social, and I don't see myself as obsessed by racial identity, but I do realize that it is much more in my consciousness because of my background than it is for white people. Right? So that was certainly one thing that informed my background. And another quick thing was because I grew up as a boomer. I am still a boomer, but I grew up in that time where television and commercials were a very, very big thing, right? I grew up at a time where television shifted from black and white into color, right?
That's how old you are.
That's how old I am, right? And so as you can imagine, TV was a big thing. We were the boob tube generation.
Right.
And I remember the messages that I would get around gender were really strong and highly conventional. Gender roles were, women had very specific gender roles, often as homemakers and emotional support, and men were the breadwinners. Dick Van Dyke Show being a very typical example. Now, I know that those gender roles are narrow. People should not be trapped by them, whether they're men, women, or have some other gender identity. But I still have to realize that that's part of the messaging that I got, right?
That's
right. So I got this messaging about, who men are supposed to be and who women were supposed to be. And also really strong messages that those were the only two genders, right? And that's, and that has changed, and in my opinion, for the better. So I have to be really careful about falling into the trap of those gender roles for myself and for others. And it's simply a part of my own background. Now, does that mean that I, confess that all the time? No, I don't. I probably confess it much more than most people do because of diversity training, the diversity training that I do. But it's important for me to recognize that, just as you recognize that some of your messages about race, once you uncovered them and understood them better, had some toxic layers. I recognize that, as an example, some of my messages about gender certainly had some toxic layers, and I can't simply dismiss them and say, oh, I know better, and therefore, that's done. I see it as a lifelong journey not to step in the cultural cow pie, if you will, and make sure that I'm not acting on those stereotypes. I'm also a gay man. And as you can imagine, my messaging growing up was that there was only heterosexuality. Um, when I went to school, it was the first, when I went to school in middle school in Ohio, something called sex education had just started, and it was really badly done. It was done by the gym teachers. I suppose they were the only ones that was available, and it ended up being mostly scare movies about sexually transmitted diseases. You know, it's like there'd be a movie called Kathy Gonorrhea question mark about, you know, this poor character Kathy who caught gonorrhea, and everybody in the school was talking about her. So the message was really clear. There is something called sex out there, but please, children, do not engage in this because you'll end up like Kathy, right? Disgraced and diseased. That was my sexual education, formal sexual education in school. But also there was a really strong message there that the only sexual orientation was certainly heterosexual orientation, right? That was the pattern for my mother and father, aunts and uncles. Certainly, in the case of Kathy and the Kathy gonorrhea story, that was her case as well. And so, as you can imagine, growing up as a young man and then as a man with a sexual orientation that wasn't heterosexual was a real journey for me, and really countercultural. So that's just a little part of my own journey and background. And I know that as we move on, we'll be sharing more and more about our backgrounds and how they have influenced us and how they both can pull us apart and pull us together. Yeah, yeah. So let me do a little switcheroo again. Nice two-shot there. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of our core beliefs around cultural diversity, and therefore, by extension, around this show. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Why don't you get us started?
Okay. It's easy for me because it's on our website. That website is the Beyond Diversity Resource Center website. I should say my website. And two really core things for me are compassion and anti-oppression. By compassion, simply mean trying to reduce the suffering of individuals across the globe. It includes everyone. It is ultimately love for humanity, respect for humanity, seeing that there is suffering out there and working to correct that. It is a noble practice, I believe. It has been mirrored by people throughout the centuries. Certainly, people like Gandhi, people like Jesus Christ, and others are models of what it means to be compassionate. But I also think it's a hard practice because there is so much suffering in the world. I feel that I sit here in the United States and I'm highly pampered compared to many people. I've never gone hungry in my life. I have never worried about my country being attacked by a foreign power. I've never worried about famine. My worries, I've never worried about a civil war that might place me in jeopardy. I've never worried about getting proper medication or doctor's care. All of those things are things that are part of my experience and not part of the experience of many people. So there's lots of opportunities to recognize the suffering of people, genocides that go on throughout the world, problems that are right here in our own society, and to do two things: to see the suffering of people squarely, not turn away from it, and then take action to do something about it, recognizing that what I can do as an individual is limited. But part of the practice of compassion is to say to oneself, I realize that I cannot alleviate all suffering. I'm going to do what I can anyway. So that's a core underlying tenet. And when I do diversity training, what that means is that I never, ever, ever turn people into the other. In fact, that's not what I do in life. So even if I disagree with an individual vehemently, right, I will never turn that person into an it, right, into something less than human, because I think therein lies the danger of dehumanizing and then ultimately, at its worst, approaching things like mass incarceration or even genocide. So don't ever want to do that. I also want to show compassion for myself. Right? I want to recognize that I am imperfect and embrace that to the extent that I can, so that I don't get caught up in trying to be perfect as I move forward. Second thing is anti-oppression. And this is really born out of my experience when I worked in the New Jersey Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations that you mentioned, and got the opportunity to meet many, many wonderful people of all racial backgrounds, of all sexual orientations and gender identities, who began to inform me about the historical legacy of the work of inclusion. And one frame that I have adopted is that of anti-oppression. And anti-oppression says that oppression exists in the world in many forms: racism, sexism, anti-Semitism. The list, unfortunately, is seemingly endless. And that it is a form of power used prejudicially to hurt people. And that it sits most strongly in institutions. Institutions are businesses, the political institutions, the courts, and the like. And so what it says is that we need to be very conscious about what institutions are doing, because it can hurt people. People get deported not simply because there's prejudice out there, for example. They get deported, and potentially wrongfully deported, because the entire engine of the state, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the police, and all of the forces that are there can come together to do something called deportation. And if due process isn't faithfully upheld, that can be oppressive to people. Other historical examples include things like slavery. It's not really possible to enslave a whole group of people unless you have the engine of society, not only the way people think, but the courts, the police, community groups, all of those people acting in ways that support the institution. And so we need to look at oppression really carefully, and we need to do some things constantly to make sure that we're working against oppression. Those things include holding up the experiences of people from marginalized groups, bringing them to the center of our conversation. Doesn't mean that it's the only conversations that we need to have, but we need to bring them to the center because they're often pushed away. We also need to be aware of the legacy of oppression that we bring with us, because if we don't do that, then we're always in neutral. We're always saying, well, what's our intention now? I didn't cause slavery. I didn't cause sexism. It's not my problem. Well, it's all of our problems in that those things still inform how we act. Just as the messages I got about gender that were often very antique and oppressive are still with me today. If I'm not careful, I can act on those things. And that's still true for us in our society and our institutions. So we want to be really careful about the legacies of oppression and talk about how they operate even today when we have said, oh, we don't believe that. And one other thing, I think we also need to be really, really careful about how it is we begin to talk about people from marginalized groups without always getting their input, right? Very often when we have been trying to fix problems like racism, sexism, and all of that, we come up with a plan. Well, let's do this to help fix the homeless problem. Let's do this to fix sexism. And in my opinion, and with the view of anti-oppression, we need to get the views of the people who are directly affected in the room. In fact, we need to take leadership from them. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones in the room, and it doesn't mean that people from marginalized groups dictate, but it does mean that we need to be accountable to people from marginalized groups if we really, really, really want to make change and progress. So that's part of who I am. It is certainly part of my work experience, but also, as you can imagine, part of my life experience. If I believe that for training, it's, well, at least for me, impossible to say, well, training's over and I can't use that in my life. So those two things are really important for me. What would you add?
The one thing, Robin, that has become, I think, a very important way to think about what it means to be in this work, to do this work, is relationship building. And I often say this when I'm working with groups of folks. I'd say, the work can be defined in many ways, but I think ultimately for me, what it feels like it really defines it in a very succinct and clear way is this is about being in authentic, trusting relationships with each other. Right. And you might say maybe, also that comes for me from my own cultural background. As it is often said that Latinos are highly relational people. And I certainly feel that in the way I've navigated the world, wherever I've been. For example, one of the things that I came to understand about me, and I've lived in different places, right? Moved from Peru, moved to Canada for 6 months, came to Jersey, moved to New Hampshire, moved to Illinois, moved back to Jersey, moved to North Carolina, moved to Michigan. I mean, I've lived in different places. Yeah. But one of the themes that I noticed in all these places that I moved to is I always looked for building a sense of community with people around. It felt like that was something that was essential for me in order to feel grounded, in order to feel a sense of belonging in every place that I lived. So again, the relational aspect of that becomes really important. One of the things when we look at folks that are leaders in this work, one of those people that I consider to be a wonderful leader is Brian Stevenson. And Brian Stevenson says, there are 4 core sort of principles of how to be in this work. One of them, he says, is we have to get proximate. We have to get proximate to the problem We can't solve any problem from a distance. So we have to get up close and personal to be able to see how it really works and operates. But then that also means that we have to get proximate to the people that are experiencing those problems. I can't pretend to know what needs to be done around uh, disability issues unless I get close to the disability community to be able to see from their own perspective how these issues are playing out and then what could be some effective solutions to addressing those issues. So proximate, being in relationship with each other. One of the things around that, Robin, if I can for a minute sort of do a little storytelling around that, because I believe that over time, right? I mean these sort of ways of thinking about it, the values that come to the surface that become really important for us that we can articulate in a clear way is not necessarily something that we have right at the very beginning. Right? These are things that, in my mind, I think develop over time through how we experience being in this space, how we experience being with us, and then eventually we're able to articulate what feels to us to be core principles on how to be in the world. Values. One of them, again, is the idea of being relational, being an authentic, trusting relationship. Maybe I would even add an accountable relationship with each other. And I think for me, one of the ways in which I learned that value was working with you and Pamela in the Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations. Because if you remember, right, my journey, again, not having thought much about race up until that point, and all of a sudden, all things that are connected to that in my lived experience begin to now show up, and I have to figure out a way to make meaning of them. In that process of me trying to make meaning of my own lived experience around race, I remember one time coming into the office and telling both you and Pamela, I need to have a conversation with you. So we went into your office, closed the door, and what I needed to share with you, because it was just sitting with me and it was very uncomfortable for me to sit with that and not speak it. I went into that office with you and Pamela, and I shared with both of you about how I received messages about Black people that were not healthy. And I received those messages at home from my parents. Because those were the memories that began to surface. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I heard this. I remember this. And all of a sudden.
And we should also say that Pamela's an African American woman.
Right. So, I shared with you, hearing messages at home. And I told you I have two sisters. One is older, one is younger than me. And as we were growing up, as kids do, they fight with each other, they scream, whatever. So they would be fighting with each other, and my mother would say to them, "You scream like Black women." Again, at the age of 10 or whatever, yeah, I heard it. But at the age of 35, it's like, wait a minute, what is this about? Right? Messages like people of Black descent would be talked about, and my mom or my dad would say, so and so is Black, but beautiful. So and so is Black, but educated. So those are the things that they were just sitting with me, and then they were really troubling me. And again, I didn't feel like I could just hold them to myself. I needed to speak them out into the universe. And because I'm in relationship with both of you at that point, and you're the ones that kind of are mentoring me in this work, I feel like if anyone can process this with me, would be you and Pam. So I went into the office and shared that with you. And I remember your response, Robin, to me, which was really hard to hear. You said to me, well, that makes me very sad. And I said, why? You said, because that means that you will never be able to see me as your equal. Man, that was just heartbreaking. And you were just speaking your truth, how that landed on you. Not clearly, right? I mean, that we're talking about 25 years ago, at least, that we had that conversation in that office. And here we are, 25 years later, still in relationship, still friends, still working together, and doing this podcast with each other. Right? So that was not the end of our relationship. But this is what I think I learned from both you and Pamela. You were able to hold that moment and hold the message or the ideas that I was bringing to you, the socialization that had been exposed to. React in your own very, authentic truth of saying, I'm feeling like this is going to be something that's always going to be between us. But not say, because of that, we're done. We're going to continue to stay in the space and dig in with each other. Authentic, trusting, accountable relationships with each other. That's what I learned from both you and Pamela in that moment. Again, I didn't know how to articulate it. I didn't even know it was a thing. I just knew that I was experiencing that with you. Over the years, and then, the three of us having even more conversations about different things, and then with other people, that's where I began to realize this is a thing. This is a really important thing. That we're able to actually own our own conditioning around these issues, sexual orientation, ability, class, all these things. We have been shaped into those things. So you model for me first, how to be able to hold a space with someone that's willing to be authentic and hold some hard truths about themselves with you, and then stay in relationship despite that hard truth.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah. And it is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard, but worth the journey.
No question.
For sure.
We know that. Again, we've been at this for such a long time, and countless relationships that we've built over time, where if we're able to stay in that sort of way of being with each other, what we have learned is it for some people they might not have the capacity to be in it with you in that way. So maybe a moment like that is it's a breaking moment. The relationship ends. But with many others that are willing to stay and work through it, what it does is it deepens the relationship. What it does is it creates a more trusting relationship. So again, for me, that has become an absolute necessity. If we're going to be in this work, we have to learn how to do that with each other.
Mm.
And then the last thing I'm going to just add into to that is like, what are values? Just the idea of how we challenge established and often even hidden narratives about a whole bunch of things. For me, one of those was always like the idea of Columbus discovered America. Right? That we know at this point, many of us, okay, that's not a thing, but I grew up in it. It was taught in school. It's all over in terms of in our culture. Right? We talk about Spain being the motherland, as if we didn't exist until Spain came over and gave us birth. I mean, that's just not true in any way. But we still talk about it though, even now. I mean, you can hear that language being used in Latin America at any given moment. So challenging those narratives, challenge. In my family, there was a narrative. Even though we knew we have indigenous descent on my mother's side, her mother was clearly a woman of indigenous descent. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't something that we denied, but it wasn't something that we dug into in any deep way. We just knew it was there. We left it alone. Whereas my grandfather from Spain, who looked very white, became an obsession for members of our family to figure out who are our long lost relatives in Spain that we have never met. And we spent countless hours and energy just trying to locate those individuals. Nobody did any research to locate long lost indigenous relatives that were right around the corner from where we lived. Much more accessible and easy to find. Right? But that's part of the narrative. I remember at one point in my family having a conversation with a family member, who was talking about indigenous people as the others. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. So you're not indigenous? Like, at what point did that happen? Because if I know my lineage and your lineage, we lost that indigenous ancestry. So you're saying that for you it doesn't exist anymore? No. Of course, she says, we're all a little bit of something, which again also becomes this vague thing. It's like, no, name it. What? What is the little something that you're talking about? But in his mind, he says, we're more white than anything else. Huh. How did that happen? Right? But again, those are the narratives. And we hold them mostly unchallenged and mostly implicit, not explicit. So for me, again, our work, one of the things that becomes extremely critical is challenging those narratives anytime that they show up. And they show up, again, in very big ways and small ways.
Cool. So, I suppose it is way too much to ask us to encapsulate the current historical and political narrative because there's too much going on. I suppose it's worth saying that as we record this, it is April 2025. And so at least people know that piece. But I figure in very broad strokes, it might be worth saying we're at the beginning of the second Trump administration. Around diversity, I also think it's fair to say that there have been attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It didn't start right now, but certainly there has been what is called, anti-wokeness, anti-DEI, and it has been said overtly and sometimes not so overtly that all of that, all of what it means to try to work for diversity, equity, and inclusion is somehow defeating of the American dream. It doesn't make America great again, and instead is a plot to, great conspiracy theory, undermine very specifically white people and replace them with people of color and other marginalized groups. And so for many places, it feels like a battle. It feels like these are very rough times for working on inclusion. And by the way, speaking of being real, my my headphone dropped out, so might as well acknowledge that happened. We're going to keep rolling.
Right. Yeah, Robin. So the idea of, at this very particular moment, launching a podcast to talk about the work, right, seems almost, a silly thing to do, right? But as you and I talked about this idea, there were two ways in which we thought about it, right? One is, just like you were saying, particularly in the last few months, there has been a barrage of misinformation about what our work is about. Again, as you said, also not new. It's not like it just started now, but it definitely has been a very orchestrated, very intentional, and very aggressive move to discredit this work, using, as we know, just complete misinformation. So, in that context, then, we talked about the need to create a space where a conversation can be had about what this work is really about, not what they are saying about. Right. So just because there's it's like the idea of flooding the zone with all of this, and that's what they're doing in a way, right? Just all over the place. Every time something comes up, they go right back. Well, it's that DEI thing. It's that really like DEI now affects the soup that you eat, right? For real, like they're just ridiculous in terms of how they're connecting everything to DEI.
Yes, planes crash, and it's a DEI problem because people
Right.
with disabilities are air traffic controllers, right?
Right. I'm surprised they didn't argue that they needed to put tariffs on everything because of DEI. But that's what they're doing, right? So they're just creating this overwhelming narrative. DEI is terrible. It's anti-American. It needs to be defeated, and we're going to go hard after it. All these executive orders, manipulating, bullying universities and law firms. I mean, that's how this is working out. So we felt, okay, you're doing that. We're going to create a space where we're actually going to have a real conversation about the real work, not what you say this is. So to some extent, it is a response to all these negative messages, what they're trying to do about discrediting the work that we do. But I also felt like even in the absence of that, that it was an interesting idea, right? To just create a space where we can just talk about the work from all kinds of angles. As we said at some point in our conversation, to hold the work for what it is, also critique it for what it is and it isn't, and what it does and it doesn't. Right. So it's all of that. So we're doing it, yes, very much in response to the current moment, but we're also doing it because we think it's worth doing, regardless.
Yeah, great. Well, I know that we're planning future episodes. One of the things that I think will be exciting is that we will have the opportunity to have guests on. Our friends.
Our friends.
Folks that we know, right? So folks, get ready. Consider the invitation already extended. We want to have more fun. We want to get people involved, all of those things. And, for my part, I'm really appreciative of, even as we've done the promo, how supportive people have ultimately been to both of us and the idea. It's nice to know that there are folks out there that, really think that the work of inclusion is important, and that this podcast, this channel, can add some useful things to the dialogue. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Anything else you wanted to add about future episodes that might be important?
No, I mean, I think, as you said, we're going to be inviting other folks. Sometimes it'll be just you and I talking about something specific. Sometimes we'll have guests. We'll also try to get a little creative in terms of how we engage our audience, right? So maybe we'll have, quizzes or things like that just, make it a little bit more engaging than simply us talking heads in front of a camera. As interesting as we think we are.
I hear you.
Yeah,
I hear you.
So, as you can see, folks, we have this invitation for us, for you all to like our channel, to subscribe. All those things, become really important, as you all know, in the algorithm, and in making this even pop up more for folks that are maybe searching for something like this. But yeah, we appreciate you being here. Appreciate you being with us over the long haul, and we look forward, to the conversations that we're going to have. See what good trouble we can get in with each other. See what feathers we're going to ruffle as we do this. But we're just excited to be able to engage in this ongoing conversation with you.
Sounds wonderful. It's nice to have this first podcast done. So thank you very much, Jorge. Thank you to our audience as well. Really appreciate your participation. And we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.